taken over the government, and he was it was Cold War. You know, Lyndon Johnson was the president. And just a few months before I got there, they had attacked the Blue House, which is like their White House. You know, over 30 North Korean commandos. They made it to the outskirts of the Blue House.
You mean they came across the 38th parallel?
Yeah.
Wow.
The DMZ was easier to cross back in those days.
Was it?
You know, it wasn't easy, but it was possible to cross it. And it might still be possible, but maybe not, because there's, you know, hundreds of thousands of minefields, which, remember, Princess Diana was against those minefields, and you know who has the most minefields and makes the most mines? General Electric, you know. And one of the reasons the U.S. didn't go along with their program was because of the minefields on the Korean DMZ. Anyway, I'll go off on tangents too much, but that's what happened. I ended up falling in love with the country and the culture and the challenge of learning the language, the culture. There were so many things different, including the mindset of the people, and even little things like the produce. I see this strange, big, leafy green plant, and I asked another GI, you know, they were all experts, right? In quotes. I said, what is that? He says, it's a cabbage. Wait a minute, cabbages are round. What's this crazy looking thing, you know? And then something else is a turnip, and it's a huge, white, like a huge carrot, you know? And it didn't look like a turnip to me. And so all these things led me to realize that their civilization was ancient and had evolved over the years, so completely different from our Western world, and including, I think, some people disagree with the way they think. You know, people like to say, "Oh, everybody in the world is the same." Well, of course we are fundamentally. You know, we all love our families, and we all, but they have different ways of looking at things, and I've been puzzling that out ever since. And I ended up going back a total of 5 different tours. And later, when the Army, in its wisdom, I had a good tour in '86, and he sent me back to sign me to Oakland, California, to become a recruiter. And I thought, what in the heck am I going to do? Because I always had secondary things I did in addition to the Army when the Army would let me. What am I going to do? The recruiter is like 6 days of the week. You work from 6 in the morning till 8 at night. And I had heard that from other guys. So I said, well, I'm going to have to do something at home. And it dawned on me, I was in the post library at Camp Red Cloud in Uijeongbu. And I'm looking around, and the 809 section, there was a book, and I swear this is the title of it. It was Maybe You Should Write a Novel. That was the title, and it was written by somebody who'd been in publishing, and he'd been an agent his whole life, and at the end of his career, he wrote that book, and I read it, and I'm reading it in our hooch with my wife, my Korean wife. Well, actually, we weren't married yet, but we got married shortly thereafter. And I'm reading it, and it comes to some part. It says, you don't have to have any special education to be a writer. You can write about your life experiences. You can be a policeman, a fireman, a nurse, a doctor, and teacher. And then he said soldier, and it's like I sat up from the floor. You know, in Korean hooches, you live on the floor, right? And I sat up. It was almost like an electric shock. And then I knew what I was going to do. And I've never...
Was it one of those GE mines? Was it one of those GE mines, though? It was a different kind of...
No, I wouldn't have gotten very far in my writing career had it been a mine.
Yeah, it's an interesting point there. You make that experience, because Michael here was, what were you, all of 21 when you wrote your first book?
I was.
How much experience did you actually, life experience?
At the time, though, I was working, and I'd worked for a couple of years as a PI and as a newspaper reporter. So,
Okay.
you know, I did have, I mean, it was definitely a much smaller, in terms of calendar years amount of time, but I think that was always something I'd sought out to feed the writings, to bring some sort of verisimilitude, and to make up the gap of understanding that all of the things that I wanted to write about, I did not have any life experience that really qualified.
But you wanted to be a writer.
But I wanted to be a
And
writer.
Martin was actually a soldier who suddenly thought maybe I could be a
Right.
writer.
Yes.
Although, didn't you write for the newspaper, the Army newspaper?
It was always something lurking in the background, but you know how our teachers, I don't know, maybe teachers were different. You know how nowadays teachers are always encouraging their students? I don't think I ever had any teachers who encouraged anybody. You know, they just tell us how dumb we were. And they tell us
Oops.
and how many things we screwed up, you know?
Sounds like
They
the Army.
were like, yeah, it was like the Army. And, you know, basically they'd tell you it's ridiculous to try to get published. You know, the odds against it are so huge. You know, nobody
So
makes a
Barbara told
living.
me when she read my first, second, and third novels, actually. She kept telling me to quit.
You are such a liar. I have nursed you as though you were a baby all this time. Wow. Well, one of the reasons I was asking Martin the question is that I think one of the terrific strengths of the series is you've taken a group of Americans, the 8th Army and adjunct, and put them down in an unfamiliar culture. And then the two cultures have to interface or fight or whatever it all is. And to me, that has been a fascinating feature of, and your two guys, because they are military criminal investigators, they work in that division, they're right there on those edges where the worst of the conflict is between the Koreans and the 8th Army. It's actually a fabulous design.
Well, you know, that comes from reality because 8th Army was plopped down in the middle of a 4,000-year-old Asian society. And one of my first jobs, I was at the 8th Army Public Affairs on my first tour, was to collate, or you might say edit. Oh, that'd be grandiose because I wasn't much of an editor. But is the English language translations of the Korean news outlets, like Hapdong and Donghua. I still remember their names. And I was supposed to go to the that's when the days we had the teletype, I guess you call it. Yeah, and we get AP, UPI, Reuters, and we got Hapdong and Donghua. And I'd go there and actually literally tear off any story that had to do with the U.S. Army. And the only official then a lot of them were crime stories. You know, 3 GIs speed up and robbed a cab driver, you know, or something like that. And then I would go to the MP station and ask them, do you have a blotter report on this? And a lot of the brass, their only interaction with Korean society was reading the blotter report every day. How many Koreans did the GIs beat up today? So that little did I know that I'd be writing about those stories someday. And I also, at the same time, I wrote for Stars and Stripes. But somehow, writing always was in the background of my life. Although and it was something I wanted to do. My hero was Jack London.
Oh,
So,
Build a
you know,
Fire is to
yeah.
me one of the, that's
I think that's the greatest piece of prose in the English language. I think, but what do I know?
extraordinary story.
Yeah, To Build a Fire. But so it was always lurking in the background, but I never thought I could do it. You know, like I like to say, George Swenio in the book sometimes, in the Army, if you could spell, they thought you were a genius. And if you could write a cogent sentence, they were suspicious.
They said that about us Indiana University graduates too.
There you go. Well, see, basically you've got 4 arenas of conflict in the stories. You've got people in the 8th Army preying on other people in the 8th Army. Sometimes it's top down. And in fact, in your new book, the one we're talking about tonight, The Nine-Tailed Fox, that's part of what happens. Mm-hmm. So you've got the 8th Army and the 8th Army guys in conflict. Then you've got the 8th Army crimes against Koreans. Then you've got Koreans running crimes against people in the 8th Army. And then you have Koreans versus Koreans. You've got Mr. Kill, for example, who in auto writing, Patrick had to correct me, I wrote down as Mr. Kim. I guess we're all, into Kim at the moment so much that
Right,
I
yeah,
was writing my
naturally.
review, Mr. Kim, there he was. But anyway, you've got this wonderful array of, people doing things to other people, up and down and sideways, and And then there's the whole thing about women. One of the things I love the most in the Nine-Tailed Fox is the two officers' wives dueling over a refrigerator. And it's really more a matter of status. You
Right.
know, that one wants to do the same thing and the other one doesn't agree. But so our slicky boys are trying to deal with this rogue refrigerator that moves out and then moves back and then there's no electrical, you know, and that kind of thing. And I think this is the first one where you've actually had the officers' wives in combat, so to speak, even if it's polite combat.
Yeah, I briefly mentioned them in one or two stories that I'm sure I have, but not this by far. Yes, it's more. It becomes a subplot. And it's pretty ridiculous.
But all true. I mean, it's the way it is.
Well, yeah,
Or
it can be because you used to have some of the officers' wives, and it's mentioned in the story. I don't know if this one or previous one will. When they go to the PX or the commissary, and especially overseas, the PX and commissary is a big deal because they're not in competition with Walmart. Especially in those days, it's the only place where you can buy American products, right? And when they go to the PX or commissary, they'd be dressed. In those days, women used to wear dresses or something, And the officers' wives are expected to dress a little better too. They're not supposed to be running around in blue jeans and a sweatshirt. But they had that kind of pressure on them. But they would go to the PX and commissary or out in public somewhere in civilian clothes, and they'd be wearing on their lapel the rank of their husband. If he was a full bird colonel, which is a big deal in the Army, right?
Yeah.
Right.
They'd have it
But
right
they
there.
I love it. Sort of like a Phi Beta Kappa key.
Right, yeah.
Slightly
Never saw
different.
that.
Right, but that's another really great, I think, joy of the series is that you alternate, really dreadful crimes with these kind of, funny or whatever I want to. In other words, there's humor. It isn't all dark all the time. In fact, there's a lot of humor. And your two guys, the way they relate and their
There's
dialogue.
a lot of humor.
I think so.
Some lighthearted.
You're like,
You say so.
I
To
don't know.
pivot away from the lighthearted.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I ask you what we were speaking about a minute ago? Or is that?
At your own risk, because
At-
you're trying to shut me up.
I think so many of your readers will, you're writing about this part of the world from an inside-out knowledge, and most of us are right now considering that part of the world from a very outsider mentality. And in the brief exchange we had, the word you used with me was you're terrified right now, and so I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about that.
Okay, we don't have a midnight curfew in this
No.
town, do we? Okay. They still used to have a midnight to 4 curfew back in those days. I'm terrified because things can go wrong. I mean, the North Koreans have perpetrated on the United States, much less South Korea, acts of war that are unequivocally acts of war. They took the USS Pueblo on the high seas. That's almost the definition of an act of war. They did that in January of 1968. I got there in June. And I'll just talk about the acts of war they perpetrated in the U.S. In May of '69, after they released the Pueblo crew, the U.S. had to sign an apology to the North Koreans to get the release. In May of '69, or it might have been April, they shot down a U.S. Navy ship, or airplane, with 31 sailors aboard. It was totally obliterated. All of them were immediately dead. That was a reconnaissance airplane. They were a spy plane. But it was in international airspace. They've done things like that time and time again. If they are to do something like that now, think of what the consequences might be. The 7th Fleet is over there. A lot of people I don't know if any of you heard about the Fat Leonard scandal. Fat Leonard is they have him locked up in the U.S. The FBI tricked him into coming to the U.S., but he's a Singapore businessman who was a multimillionaire who was making fortunes by working with the 7th Fleet, the U.S. Navy 7th Fleet. And he services the ships.
Oh.
Give them mooring, you know, takes supplies off, takes things off, you know, takes supplies to it, takes waste off, and supplies them with fuel and food and on and on and on. And not only in Singapore, but all elsewhere around the Pacific. And he was paying off the Seventh Fleet, literally paying them off.
High-level racketeering, basically.
Right.
Of the,
Yeah.
Yeah, but what's stunning is there's so many high-ranking military officers were involved. You know, every now and then we know we have a bad apple, but there was over 300 of them are under suspicion. Like 50 of them have been indicted, about 5 or 6 of them are already in prison. And we're talking about a captain of a ship and even higher. And that's the Seventh Fleet that we're relying on right now. And yet it's never talked about in the news because Fat Leonard was so overwhelmed by the news we've had in the last 2 years. But it would have
One
been
bizarre thing after another.
Yeah.
right. It would have been a huge scandal because it's bigger than Tailhook. You remember the Tailhook
Yeah.
scandal? That's a bunch of boys acting poorly, very poorly, and it was deservedly a terrible scandal.
Right.
But this is much worse. They were taking millions of dollars from this guy in money and services, but sometimes actual cash.
Right.
Right, but
And
we've
these-
heard
this is
that about
people who are
Iraq.
admirals and-
Yeah,
yeah.
we've heard that that's happened in Iraq. It certainly happened in Vietnam.
Uh-huh.
You know, when there's so much money flowing and not enough people paying attention. You
It
know,
happens.
it's-
It
But,
happens here.
but that impacts our North Korea because the Seventh
does.
Fleet. I don't know, you know, like President Trump one time said, "I'm sending an armada to North Korea." Unfortunately, it was on its way to Australia, but you know, just the wrong left turn.
Come on.
But you know, I don't know how much the Seventh Fleet has over there, but the Seventh Fleet. The reason I mention it is because it's when you're out at sea, obviously, and with air operations, there's so many opportunities for some interaction with the North Koreans. There's less on land. The Army and the Korean Army are along the DMZ where they've always been. But I'm very worried that there's going to be a miscalculation, a mistake, that Kim Jong-il will do something to save face in response to something that Donald Trump says, or Donald Trump will do something to save
Save
face
face.
too.
We have two basic narcissists, you know, wanting to save face in a sandbox and very poor
But
impulse
with Kim
control
Jong-un, saving face is
is the whole game.
it's you know, he's also saving his life by saving face. He starts losing face vis-a-vis his military officers. He might not be
It's
around very
survival.
long. Yeah, it's his survival. Yeah.
It's horribly unpredictable. It takes me back to when I was, you know, in junior high school and high school in the Cold War, and we worried a lot that, wasn't that Dr. Strangelove, if I
Yeah.
remember right?
Yep.
You know, that there would be some accidental firing
back in-
trigger or something, and there it goes, you know. And I thought we were incredibly fortunate that didn't happen.
Just went
But
back and reread 13 Days. You know,
Yes.
you look at that now and consider the personalities we have now
right,
presented with the same calculus, and it's just
But isn't
terrible.
that what Martin said is a real good point,
Right.
because my father was the head of the air defense system for the Midwest, where they used to have the Nike sites
Right.
around at Fort
Harlan
Sheridan.
Coleman was here last week talking about the Nike site in
Yeah.
his suburban New Jersey home. Yeah.
Well, those were nuclear weapons, and the people who were running these places were idiot soldiers, and half of them were idiots. And what Martin said is true. Most of them couldn't get a decent job in the outside, but they were responsible for nuclear weapons. And my father was scared to death for years, just praying that a mistake wasn't made.
Which site was he stationed?
It was the Chicago, northern Indiana area.
Okay. Yeah.
They had all over, but they were based all over. I mean, you had Nike, Hercules. I mean, some of the stories I could tell you, just like Martin can. There's a lot of morons in this service.
Well,
Look at
Never
the two-
reassuring.
I think that's a real
Well, look at the two Navy
possibility,
ships
but-
that just crashed into
Yeah, you kinda
tankers
wonder what
because the
happened there.
sailors
Yeah.
weren't paying attention. I
Yes,
mean,
that was really embarrassing, wasn't it? So your
anyway.
point is that the Seventh Fleet could either accidentally trigger something off because of some stupidity, or they may not be up to the task if they actually have to do something.
Oh, I think they're up to this
Do you?
task. If a war actually were to break out, the North Koreans, okay, I think are somewhat overrated because in the U.S. military, individual initiative is a very important thing. You have to move, shoot, and communicate. The North Korean armed military isn't allowed to communicate between each other. except on very limited things. Think about it. When you're the top dog, the dictator, you don't want your colonels talking to each other. Because what are they liable to do? Say, let's get rid of this idiot. So they don't communicate. They can't move. Their supplies come directly from Pyongyang. They don't want, they're worried about, people, again, communicating through supply channels. And they also have limited petroleum. So the military can't, they would cause horrible destruction in the first 1, 2, 3 days. The U.S. would, they have huge artillery pieces that are in caves in North Korea that are big enough to hit Seoul, high explosive artillery. And they actually have been there so long, they've dug into these granite mountains, and they have the guns on railroad track rails, so you can roll them out. You don't even need power. If your power goes out, you roll out the gun, you fire. When the U.S. planes start coming at you, you roll it back in. So to take these things out would be a terrible job, and there's thousands of them. And the U.S. is up to it. The problem is it would take days, and in the meantime,
They could do a lot
What's
of
the
destruction.
toll?
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, we are actually here to talk about the book, so let me say that
On a lighter note.
I think
This is where that humor comes in.
I really feel that Martin's books open a window to an area of the world that, has been kind of a quiet hotspot for a long time, and all of a sudden is not. And so you can learn a lot more about their psychology, about the whole concept of face. Reading them. But let's talk about the Nine-Tailed Fox, and this is where I think that you and Michael have a real interface. The use of superstition, or maybe even the supernatural, to write a thriller. Well, I'll let you take over there because you have done an exemplary job with that.
Oh, well, thank you.
And there is one in here.
To me, it's I love crime novels and I love ghost stories, but I think what the supernatural can bring in and say about place and people, that intersection of old mythologies and the way those sort of permeate. Legends inform people about their ancestors, but then I think there's also always this fascinating question of, well, why did my ancestors, why did my predecessors believe this? And then I think a lot of us have that, you talked about the power going out. It's in those things that happen in the dead of night, and you remember these old legends and the way people used to make sense of the world. And then all of a sudden, in the right night with the right storm, the legend suddenly seems like maybe a little more plausible. And I love to grab that atmosphere and that emotional connection with the reader. So that's why I've been drawn to it as a writer. So I'm curious what draws you to that same idea then, Martin?
Well, the Nine-Tailed Fox is a mythical creature that is in the folklore of China, Korea, and Japan. All three of them have
Is it?
Interesting.
I didn't realize it was all three. I
Right.
thought it was just Korea.
No, it's all three.
Oh.
And as a matter of fact, Nine-Tailed Fox is, three Chinese characters. It's the first one being nine, and then then tail, and then fox. And of course, it's pronounced differently in all three languages.
But the characters are the
Three characters are the same, yeah. And there's even a lighthearted television show in South Korea called The Nine-Tailed Fox.
Is there?
Yeah, and it's sort of like Bewitched. Same where the wife is where the wife is happens to be this mythical creature, and her husband is a middle-class guy. So it's the same type of idea. But the Nine-Tailed Fox in the old folklore is basically a beautiful woman, and the way it works is they thought foxes were immortal, and they were only killed by violent action or something. So if a fox was smart enough to live for 1,000 years, then the gods would look down on the fox and turn the fox into a woman. but they'd still have the 9 tails. But then it was, sometimes the tails are invisible, other times they hide them under the big skirts, that sort of thing. But they're known to be extremely intelligent, extremely beautiful, extremely challenging, also very dangerous.
Dangerous, that's the key part here.
Oh
right?
yeah. And I can tell you at least one folk tale if you want to hear it. But that's the general idea. And then the book starts with 3 GIs have disappeared in a fairly close amount of time. 8th Army GIs. So those days there were over 50,000 American service people, Air Force, mostly Army, and just a smattering of Navy, Marines, very few. And they disappeared. Doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to why they disappeared. And that's the very first scene. They explain why this doesn't. And the chief of staff, by the way, in the series, the Slicky Boys, you call them, George Svenio and Ernie Baskin, are finally starting to get some respect. Because
gradually.
So the chief of staff takes them into the morning briefing, and they're talking about these 3 guys missing, and he has George and Ernie not sitting at the table but around the edge, and in that kind of chair, not this kind of chair. And he basically assigns them to figure out what happened to these 3 guys, and as they early in the book, as they are investigating, some old guy, some old reprobate, old sergeant, and then the Korean barmaid near where one of these guys disappeared. She says it was an older woman, a woman about 40, but very well dressed, very attractive, and the GI who disappeared was in his 20s, early 20s. And he had become infatuated with him. Anyway, the Korean barmaid calls her a 9-tailed fox. In other words, they saw her as some sort of enchantress, an unusual person.
Oh, and lured these 3 guys to their doom, so to speak. Right.
They find out at first, of course, one, and then it starts to seem like she maybe lured all 3 of them.
That's really interesting, and Michael, you've done this too. If you take, a spectral ghost or, some sort of legend, and because people believe it, you can either have people impersonating one, or you can just have the power of that shape how people think about something.
Yeah, exactly. I think it opens the door. For me, the type of stories that I enjoy the most that have a supernatural element are always grounded in the real knowable world.
Right.
So you're on equal footing with the characters who are experiencing their own layers of disbelief, and then are also reluctant to share what they've experienced or feel they've experienced with the others. From Ira Levin to Richard Matheson to King and Peter Straub, I think that's when it really works, is when you can ground it in this knowable reality, and then you bring in that thing that's just a little bit off, and I think that heightens the emotional investment and opens should widen out the possibilities of the mystery and just increase and heighten the suspense of it. And I think if you're drawn to telling mysteries, telling these types of stories, I think at some point, I think most of us end up drifting to, whether it's a short story or a novel, tackling some level of the ghost story, because the thing that goes bump in the night is of infinite appeal from storytellers. So.
Well, you want your reader to engage and be scared, but readers generally bring some level of disbelief. It's suspension of disbelief to reading a story anyway, right? So if there might be a 9-tailed fox for the reader, part of what you have to decide is whether you're going to believe in the fox or whether you're going to say, no, it's something else going on.
Yeah, what's really going on here?
Right. That I find that's a really powerful element of fantasy and science fiction. But of course, there's already alerts there that it's probably just imaginary when you're in that genre. the whole world building thing. But I think your genius is that, you write about all that in a foreign place, in a foreign culture with legends we don't know, but you make them believable, understandable for us. I've learned so much from reading your books. And I'll probably never go to Korea. Certainly not now.
Or run into a nine-tailed fox.
Well, I
never
might have
says-
a better chance to run into the fox.
Gonna walk into a dark alley here later tonight.
Well, another thing that happens too later in the story is that as they mentioned the nine-tailed fox, like the second division who they're in competition with, had their MPs had also heard that mentioned, but they didn't report it. Not just the mention, but the whole thing, because the officer above, the MP officer, says, "I'm not going to put out a blotter report that talks about a nine-tailed fox."
Blow back on me, right? Yeah.
He doesn't want to look ridiculous to his superiors. George and Ernie, they mention it, and of course they're ridiculed, and it makes their job tougher. So it has a practical effect.
So their general, investigative technique is just to sort of go out and boulder. It's actually just like Spencer.
In a way,
Spencer,
yeah.
it really is.
Yeah.
Spencer
It's
would get
funny.
a case.
I
and
was
he
just
would-
thinking that. As a matter of fact, that probably has influenced me because I remember one of the Spencer books. They asked him, "What do you do to investigate?" He says, "I just go around and annoy people."
That's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
You ask good questions.
Yeah. And Ernie and George are really good at that, and they're kind of
They're
outsiders
pretty annoying though.
too. Each of them their own personal background and so forth. They're not from mainstream America to start with, so
They both had trouble fitting into the army because
Right.
The army's a bureaucracy, and you want to get ahead, you play the bureaucratic game. Everybody I think who's been in the military has known people who've risen very fast because they were good at that game, and often they're also good at their job, or sometimes people rise because they're good at their job.
But I think any
not
military
always.
structure is like that. Even
Of
the
course,
police
yeah.
department, actually corporations, I can give you
Yeah.
endless examples of publishing companies.
yes.
This very thing.
Cut. Let's talk privately, right?
No, I mean, I myself, a long time ago when I was an intern and then should have stayed on at the Library of Congress, concluded that I would never fit the civil service. And you can't be a librarian at the Library of Congress unless you also belong to the civil service and have a and you all know me because we're a small group here. You can't even imagine that I would have functioned well in that structure. And that's it. So you're two guys.
Only unless you had a long game you were playing.
I'm not patient enough for that. And it was just never going to work. I loved doing it. And it was an interesting thing. I was sitting on the lawn of the Supreme Court eating, my after lunch ice cream bar or something or other, and not the Librarian of Congress, but the guy who's actually running the Library of Congress at that point came by and he looked at me. He came over and sat down. He said, in every class, he said, there's one like you. Oops.
Compliment or was that?
Kind of.
Eye of the beholder.
But basically what he said, we get a number of people every year and they want to come and learn and make careers here. And then we get one like you who just wants to learn it, but you aren't going to stay in the structure. And I thought that was good. And really that's kind of George and Ernie, they're doing their job. They didn't fit in that well at home. They don't fit that well into the 8th Army. But if you want somebody to go out and do something unusual, they are your guys. They're not bucking for advancement. They're not really looking to build a career, and so they're perfect.
Thank you. They also in those days it still is. Have any of you gone to an Asian city and just gone around on your own
Yep.
and it ain't easy sometimes.
Thank
if you
God.
don't.
No, it's a challenge. For one thing,
Yeah.
you can't ever read. The worst time we ever had was we rented a car. Lori King spuriously told us that she had learned enough kanji. And so we're in Japan and we've rented a car, and in the car, the only GPS system in the car is also in kanji. So we are driving around. We are completely disoriented, and you can't. There's not only are all the landmarks and all new to you because you're in a foreign place, but you can't read a map. And if you go in and ask somebody, they can't really help you, and so it's a very disorienting an
Right.
interesting experience.
You're not sure what the customs are, what the rules are, where you can park, all that sort of thing. And so George and Ernie, they are able to go out into the Korean society and function,
Right.
and they enjoy that.
But now one of them has actually learned, or both of them, Korean, right? Or, I mean, at
George,
least working
George.
Korean.
George has,
isn't
yeah.
it?
Well, he took the night classes,
Right.
which they offered, and none of the
Right.
GIs take. A lot of them sign up for it and they drop out after the first week.
Right. But George can, in fact, interrogate Koreans.
And
Now,
Ernie's got words and phrases.
He does.
Most of them.
For women.
well, that's true. But still, George. But now let's talk about Mr. Kill, aka Mr. Kim, but actually Mr. Kill for a minute, because he's a completely fascinating character,
Thank
and
you.
you've taught him to speak English by good fortune, right?
Well, yeah, he was in the Korean National Police even during the Korean War,
Right.
and he's been in the Korean National Police for like 30 years. He's managed to rise up to the chief homicide inspector, which is really difficult. The Korean government is Machiavellian, literally. And but during the Cold War, he had a university education in Korea, and he also had studied classical Chinese, so he had a classical education. Obviously, he's a brilliant guy. And during the Cold War, he had been selected to go to an Ivy League school in the States, because the States trains a lot of people, military and civilian, in the Cold War to be anti-communist cadres for us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you had people like the president of Nicaragua, Somoza. He goes to Fort Bragg, gets trained when he was a young man. A lot of the people who later became famous would go to the States and get trained in education or on military bases or both. So I have him has gotten that kind of training, and his English is excellent.
And he works with Ernie and George, so
Yeah, he understands Ernie and George.
Right. Well, also he's a brilliant guy. He's practical. He knows they're the only two GIs in American military law enforcement that are worth a damn.
Trust.
That can actually go out and
But
get
he's
something
also he's also a guy who thinks outside the box too.
Oh, yeah.
He's an
Yeah.
unorthodox kind of. He's he's sort of a Bosch over there in Korea. And really, let's face it, to be completely effective doing criminal investigation, you do need access to lawmen who can enforce things. So Ernie and George can get the Eighth Army to deal with miscreants, but they can't really deal with Korean miscreants because they don't have any clout, but Mr. Kill can.
done.
So
There's jurisdictional problems.
yeah.
Also-
so they've come along as a kind of a threesome.
Well, yeah.
But Mr. Kill didn't show up at the beginning. When
Well,
did he come
right.
along?
Well, part of it was, just as I'm trying to devise stories and new investigations for George and Ernie, I realized these two guys are hated by Eighth Army brass. If you're in the Army and you're hated by your superiors, you don't get much done. So I had to find a way for them to continue to be as obstinate as they are. But Mr. Kill then can go talk to his boss, the Ministry of the Interior, who talks to the U.S. ambassador, who then sends it down to the chief of staff, eventually the provost marshal. And I've experienced this myself, where people who are civilians and sort of outside the military structure, if somebody says, well, send these two guys over here to do this, the military doesn't want to because they're jealous and angry at them and don't want them to get any status or step up on their
There's
boss.
a lot of face in the military, isn't
Oh,
there?
yeah. And yet the civilians can't understand. Well, what? Two guys, you got 50,000, you can't send these two guys over there? So they don't see any problem with it.
Right.
So George and Ernie are sent then, they're assigned to Mr. Kill, and they go down to the town to the Korean National Police headquarters, and they're off on an adventure. But the knives are pulled back at 8th Army, and they're waiting for them. We'll get you somehow. You'd be mopping the floor once you come back,
It sounds like
And
it
I've
might
mopped
be
plenty of
just
floors, by the way.
military thrillers but these are actually incredibly complicated and interestingly
Yeah, you're
plotted
right.
crime novels. And I am always surprised. I don't think I've read a single one of your book where I ever figured out what was going on until
Well,
We
neither
got
did
there.
I. Well, that's right.
Maybe that's the secret. No, seriously, I read so much of it, and oftentimes I'm on page 30 and I think, it's going to, whatever it is. But I have to say that you really have a genius for plotting.
Thank you.
I mean, if you guys read,
Yeah.
so
I read
do you
them all
feel
together.
the same way?
Yeah.
Is that one of the reasons you read him? Is because
course.
you're so surprised by what's.
Well, if you guys understand the plots, would you please explain them to me?
For George and Ernie and like Riley and Strange, are they based off of people you met while in the service?
Okay, can I turn off the camera? No.
Well, not yet, but we can.
Wait, what was that?
Actually, we can. You know what? We've been watching Facebook. Miles, I think we'll say goodbye to our Facebook audience. Hello.
Well,
I can't turn it off myself because I don't know how it actually works.
no, I don't need it.
Right. Miles, are you back there?
Well, actually, for me, you don't have to turn it off.
No,
but
no,
if you
no.
want to.
We're going to exit. Sorry, I should have given you. I think we've done a very nice job. Thank you all for coming, and we're going to move on now into private questions. And you can come tonight. You two
What about the
could
cake?
do it. Yeah, we're going to have cake.
there was that.
I don't teach them.
Exactly.
All
Lots of
right,
good
yeah, you can
questions.
say
and-
whatever you want. Right. That camera's not working, right? It is working. It finally worked.
It's so it got booted up, yeah.
Why don't we say goodnight to our live stream audience as well?
All right.
And I will say the same thing. Had you come, you could have participated in the end of the program, but thank you very much for coming as long as you did.